Back in 1975, some marketing genius thought up the idea of selling pet rocks, and folks actually bought them. Not because they had any particular use for them, but because their friends had them and they didn't want to be left out. And the way Dr. Craig is trying to sell this notion of ultimate meaning, value, and purpose, it almost sounds like he's pursuing the same sort of marketing strategy. Except, of course, that if you bought a pet rock, at least you got an actual rock, whereas Dr. Craig don't even have that much. Hey there, folks. Bertram the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on the book On Guard by Dr. William Lane Craig. And so far, Dr. Craig has been trying to make us feel bad about the notion that they supposedly ain't no ultimate meaning, value, or purpose in life if they ain't no God. Which is fine, only for some reason he don't never explain what this so-called ultimate meaning, value, and purpose is supposed to be, or why we're supposed to want it. You'd think if he wanted us to feel bad about not having it, he'd tell us what it was so as we could appreciate what we's missing. So far, the only thing he's actually specified about what it is that it ain't eternal life. In fact, it sounds kind of like he's saying that God himself is the ultimate meaning, value, and purpose in life, which sounds nice and pious and all, except if that's the case, then Dr. Craig's argument boils down to saying that if they ain't no God, then they ain't no God. And it don't seem to me like you need a PhD in philosophy to figure that out. Anyways, in the next part of Chapter 2, Dr. Craig is going to try to show us that we can't live lives that's consistent with an atheistic worldview, specifically in terms of meaning, value, and purpose. And he's going to start with meaning. Quote, "We saw that without God, life has no meaning, yet philosophers continue to live as though life does have meaning." End quote. And by philosophers, of course, he don't mean what philosophers today is saying. He means what philosophers were saying back in the mid-1900s in the aftermath of World War II. Because why would you want to keep up to date with philosophical trends when you can go back 75 years and find a quote mine you can use to make it sound like there's a reason to believe in God? Quote, "For example, Sartre argued that one may create meaning for his life by freely choosing to follow a certain course of action. Sartre himself chose Marxism." End quote. Gasp! Marxism? Oh no, say it ain't so. See, here's where the collusion between Christianity and capitalism raises its head. Karl Marx proposed the radical idea that the folks that does all the work should be the ones that benefit from the profits of their labor, which of course is a direct threat to the established practice of taking profits away from the folks that do the work and giving it to wealthy shareholders. So naturally, the wealthy folks in control of the media, the economy, and the government launched a campaign to demonize socialism and portray Karl Marx as basically Satan incarnate. And, of course, it didn't help socialism's reputation none when authoritarian despots like Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler made a pretense of adopting socialist ideals in order to establish themselves as dictators who then proceeded to carry out appalling atrocities. And that's what Dr. Craig is playing into here. He don't want to talk about whether maybe Sartre had a point about the injustice of exploiting workers to profit the wealthy. He just wants to paint Sartre as an evil atheist promoting the quote-unquote evils of Marxism. And it ain't even relevant to the point he's trying to make here. It's just an offhand, oh, by the way, poisoning of the well. The point he's trying to make is that he claims this is inconsistent. Quote, "Now this is totally inconsistent. It is inconsistent to say that life is objectively absurd and then to say you may create meaning for your life." End quote. But of course, it ain't inconsistent at all. Even if we agree that life is objectively absurd, meaning there ain't no objective meaning outside of our personal experience of meaning, it still is the case that meaning is fundamentally subjective. Meaning ain't meaning unless it means something to somebody. And real life is full of that kind of meaning. I suppose if you wanted to quibble with what Dr. Craig says that Sartre is saying, you could argue that we don't so much create meaning as just discover it. Meaning comes from our circumstances, from our experience, from our intentions and aspirations, and most importantly of all, from our connections with other folks. And by other folks, I don't mean some imaginary deity who by sheer coincidence just happens to have the exact qualities and opinions that you happen to think a real God ought to have. I mean real folks, your friends, your loved ones, your family, and, well, in a way, even your adversaries. Real people are the source of at least most of the meaning, value, and purpose in life. And it's only when we turn our focus onto real people that we have an unimpeded view of what genuine meaning, value, and purpose really are. But Dr. Craig seems blissfully unaware of this fact. He thinks he has the perfect gotcha, and he ain't afraid to use it. Quote, Sartre's program is actually an exercise in self-delusion, for the universe doesn't really acquire a meaning just because I happen to give it one. Suppose I give the universe one meaning and you give it another. Who's right? End quote. And we might just as well ask, suppose two baseball teams is playing a game, and the winning team gives the game-winning home run one meaning, yay we win, and the losing team gives that same home run a different meaning. Boo, we lose. So who's right? Well, obviously they both are, because meaning is subjective. And this gets back to the peculiar way that Christian apologists likes to use the word objective. The word objective technically refers to something that exists independently of any conscious entity's perception of it. But that ain't how apologists use the term. When apologists say objective, they's talking about having some kind of supreme authority to dictate whose opinion is right and whose is wrong. They's talking about some kind of divine because I said so that's going to end all the arguments and overrule any objections. And that's a cop-out. It's a way of saying, look, I don't want to have to study the facts and arrive at a rationally justified conclusion. God said it, I believe it, and that settles it. And of course, if there ain't no God to say it in the first place, then you can't say that. If there ain't no God to arbitrarily declare that Christians is right and everybody else is wrong, well, Christians has their work cut out for them, because now they has to actually justify their conclusions and come up with rational reasons that other folks can challenge and possibly falsify. And that ain't an appealing prospect, or at least not to Christian apologists. So in a way, it makes sense that Dr. Craig would use this line of reasoning in a book addressed to Christians. It's a philosophical dog whistle, reminding them that if there ain't no God to arbitrarily declare that the Christian meaning is the correct one, then Christians ain't got a leg to stand on. So in that sense, it's understandable that believers would see life without God as a pretty negative outcome. Dr. Craig next tries to make the same argument with respect to moral values. And not surprisingly, he makes the same mistake. Quote, atheistic humanists are totally inconsistent in affirming the traditional values of love and brotherhood. The view that there are no values is logically incompatible with affirming the values of love and brotherhood. End quote. But again, the fact that there ain't no values that's not subjective don't change the fact that most folks have common values that are subjective. Moral values come from a combination of two things, empathy and an awareness of material consequences. Empathy provides the subjective component of morality, and material consequences provides the objective component. And the result is a common set of moral values that's mostly consistent across societies and individuals, with enough exceptions to demonstrate that there ain't no objective universal moral values that's necessarily held by everybody. Dr. Craig understands this well enough to make a strong appeal to empathy by sharing horror stories from the concentration camps of World War II, including a story about Dr. Mengele deliberately starving a baby to death just to watch how it died. Basically, torturing a baby for fun, despite what apologists say about everybody agreeing that it's wrong to do that. Well, the thing is, it don't take no God for us to have empathy and an awareness of material consequences. And therefore, it don't take no God for us to have moral values. Moral values ain't something that's arbitrarily dictated from on high. They come from our experiences as a social, empathetic species that's intelligent enough to understand material cause and effect. Now, did philosophers in the mid-1900s do a good job of articulating exactly how and why moral values exist? Maybe, maybe not. The history of philosophy is dominated by theological and metaphysical assumptions that philosophers understand better than anybody else. And I can understand how it could be a struggle to deconstruct the burden of thousands of years of theistic thought. But if they did have problems digging through it all, that don't equate to some kind of impossibility that moral values could exist apart from God. All it means is that in the mid-1900s, some folks had a hard time articulating exactly how they can and do exist in a godless universe. Just like physicists can still fall down even without being able to articulate exactly how gravity works at a quantum level. Of course, being a modern-day apologist, Dr. Craig can't pass by an opportunity to invoke the great atheistic boogeyman, Richard Dawkins. After claiming that Sartre could not live with the implications of his own denial of ethical absolutes, Dr. Craig writes this, quote, "Neither can the so-called new atheists like Richard Dawkins. For although he says that there is no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference, he is an unabashed moralist. He even goes so far as to offer his own amended 10 Commandments for guiding moral behavior, all the while marvelously oblivious to the contradiction with his ethical subjectivism." End quote. And of course, Richard Dawkins has gone all anti-woke these days, which has considerably undermined his attempts to appeal to moral values and humanist ideals. But even granted that he, as an individual, has embraced hypocrisy and betrayed his own claimed ethical ideals, that don't change the fact that moral values come from empathy and an awareness of material consequences. When Richard Dawkins praises transphobes and denies science in order to slander trans folks and promote abuse of trans kids, what's he doing? He's rejecting empathy. He knows that what he's doing is abusive and causes needless suffering, and he just don't care. His lack of empathy, despite his awareness of the material consequences, is what makes him worthy of moral condemnation. No God necessary. And that's a good thing, because God ain't going to be no help here at all. Despite the Bible's complete and total lack of criticism regarding transgendered folks, conservative evangelical Christians, for the most part, nurtures an unprovoked hostility toward trans kids, to the point that Dawkins himself has taken to calling himself a cultural Christian as an expression of solidarity with Christian transphobia. Which, incidentally, brings up another problem with this notion of so-called objective moral values. There's no room for growth and improvement as science learns more about the biology of sex and gender. Like I said before, when Christian apologists talks about objective moral values, they don't mean moral values that exist independently of any conscious entity's thoughts and perceptions. They mean moral values they can arbitrarily impose on other folks on the grounds that some supreme authority simply dictated it. That way they don't need to learn and understand all the new information science has uncovered. And more importantly, they don't have to provide a rational, verifiable justification for their transphobia, which is convenient considering that no such justification exists. But moving on. We's done meaning, we's done value, now it's time for purpose. And this is a tough one because Dr. Craig has to try and make it sound like being free to pursue your own dreams and ambitions is the most desperately hopeless situation we could find ourselves in. Quote, "The only way most people who deny purpose in life live happily is either by making up some purpose, which amounts to self-delusion, or by not carrying their view to its logical conclusions. The temptation to invest one's own petty plans and projects with objective significance and thereby to find some purpose to one's life is almost irresistible. End quote. So let's unpack what he's saying here. Dr. Craig, along with other apologists, has thought up some kind of supposedly supreme objective purpose that's infinitely better than all the other purposes in the world, even though they can't actually tell us what this awesome purpose is or why it's supposed to be so great. And because they's imagined this supreme objective purpose, they gets to tell the rest of us that we's only fooling ourselves when we set reality-based goals with a reasonable chance of success that will produce tangible benefits in our own lifetimes. Apparently, the fact that our goals weren't imposed on us by some kind of outside force means that they ain't real goals somehow. And when we do pursue our own goals and achieve tangible, real-world benefits and are satisfied with the results, right, that's just us poor deluded folks investing our petty plans and projects with an illusory objective significance because we supposedly just deceiving ourselves. I don't know. It sounds to me like Dr. Craig is indulging in some first-class projection here. He's convinced himself that for some strange reason, goals and purposes has to have some kind of universal objective significance in order to have any significance at all. And he's accusing us of believing the same thing and then lying to ourselves about whether or not our projects has objective significance. But once again, significance is a subjective experience, not an objective phenomenon. Significance don't exist on its own. It's only significant if it's significant to somebody. And different folks can find different significance in the same thing, like the way the winning home run has different significance to you depending on which team you're on. What Dr. Craig has failed to establish here is an argument for why our dreams and ambitions even need some kind of universal cosmic objective significance in order to be worth our time and effort. He rants on and on about how our personal goals ain't objective, as if that was somehow unexpected or untenable, but he don't never explain why objectivity is a requirement. The whole thing is an exercise in setting up arbitrary standards that can't nobody live up to just so he can say, see, your worldview don't pass the test. And what's ironic here is that if and there was a real God, his divine meaning, value, and purpose would also fail this test because they'd be subjective to him personally. They'd be the product of his own subjective perspective on the meaning, value, and purpose of life, which means even God don't have any objective meaning, value, or purpose. But then again, that ain't how Christian apologists use the term objective. When they say objective purpose, they mean a purpose they can impose on other folks, whether or not other folks has purposes of their own that they'd rather be pursuing. It's all about social dominance and controlling other folks. Well, there's a fine line between hammering home a point and beating a dead horse. And Dr. Craig passed that line a long time ago. He quote mines a feller named Dr. D.L. Rue to claim that we has to tell ourselves a quote-unquote noble lie so's we'll work cooperatively to build a better society instead of adopting either totalitarianism or the mayhem of every man for himself. But the thing is, that ain't a lie. If it was really a lie, he wouldn't call it noble and he wouldn't see no benefit in telling it. We ain't just telling ourselves that cooperation works best. We've learned it through long, hard experience. We've tried every man for himself, and we've tried totalitarianism, and we've tried everything in between. And what we've learned is that the system that works best for most folks is to strike a balance between competition and cooperation such that everybody has maximal opportunity to thrive both as individuals and as a community. That ain't a lie, that's practical experience, and that's sufficient reason for us to put it into practice regardless of whether or not philosophers can come up with an abstract, formal, philosophical justification for it. That's what works, so that's how we should live. Dr. Craig goes on to give his own personal testimony, as apologists loves to do, and he's polished it up a bit, as apologists also loves to do. And then he goes on to try and close the deal. He's tried to convince us that life without God ain't got no meaning, value, nor purpose, and now he's going to try and tell us that the Christian God is going to make it all better. Quote, according to the Christian worldview, God does exist and life does not end at the grave. Biblical Christianity therefore provides the two conditions necessary for a meaningful, valuable, and purposeful life: God and immortality. Because of this, we can live consistently and happily within the framework of our worldview. End quote. And that's it. That's his whole argument. Never any explanation of why our lives ought to need what he calls ultimate objective meaning, value, and purpose. Never any explanation of what this ultimate objective meaning, value, and purpose is supposed to be, and never any explanation of how exactly we're supposed to obtain ultimate objective meaning, value, and purpose out of the existence of God and eternal life. Considering that the Bible says most folks is destined for eternity in hell, seems to me that if Dr. Craig accepted his own premises, he ought to conclude that an atheistic worldview is most appropriate to most of the people most of the time. Might as well live life to the fullest while you got it, consider it. But, of course, that ain't how you sell books of apologetics, so Dr. Craig sticks to preaching to the choir. And meanwhile, the rest of us is out here living lives filled with meaning, value, and purpose that's based on actual lived experience in the real world and on the connections we has with real folks. And that's consistent with a worldview that don't assume against all evidence that meaning, value, and purpose has to come from some imaginary deity who just happens to be made in the image of whatever apologists think a real God ought to be. So no, Dr. Craig, for all your emotion-laden hysterics about ultimate meaning and purpose, you ain't got nothing the rest of us actually need, which is why you can't manage to ever articulate exactly what this ultimate meaning and purpose is supposed to be. The real world, here and now, is more than enough to occupy our time and attention, and we're just going to go on ahead and save the fantasies for entertainment. And I'm sure there's more that could be said, but that's going to about do it for me for today. Next time, we're going to open up Chapter 3 entitled, quote, Why Does Anything at All Exist? End quote. Which, considering that God himself is also supposed to be a thing that exists, is going to prove to be a trickier question than Dr. Craig is necessarily going to be prepared to address. So stay tuned. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.